Welcome everyone! In this video, we show you how you can create this login sign-up design. We will be discussing a lot about the position widget inside of a stack, how to add some basic animations without writing a lot of codes. Also share some tips and tricks and best practices along the way that you can use when creating your app with Flutter. If it is your first time, on this channel we talk about web and mobile app development, using different languages and frameworks, especially Flutter. Since this is a long video, I've broken it down into multiple sections. You can also find the breakdowns for the different sections in the timeline below or in the description of the video. With that said, let's jump into the video. I have already created a starter project to spare some time in me typing everything out. So here we have an image folder for this background image, a config folder where I've created a palette class with a couple of static variables for the colors that we'll be using in the app. I have also configured the pubspec.yaml for the image and added this Flutter icons package that gives us access to more than 1000 icons. Inside of the main.dot file is just a material app widget that calls our login signup screen class. The login signup screen is a stateful widget. I have already created 3 state variables to manage the different states of the screen. We will use them later as we are creating this screen. The build method returns the scaffold. Let's start by adding a background color to the scaffold using our palette.background color. In the body of the scaffold, we'll add a stack widget. We need a stack because, as you can see in the app, we have widgets on top of other widgets. And with the stack, you can use the position widget that is particularly useful when you want to position a widget in an exact spot of the screen. Let's create our first position widget for the header of the screen. We'll give it a top of 0. To create this part of the screen, we will use 2 containers, one for the background image and another for the overlay color above the image. We'll give the first one a height of 300. Then, we will use the decoration property of the container to add the image to the background. It takes a decoration image. We will get the image that we added in the pubspec.yaml using the constructor of the asset image class and passing the path of the image. For the image to be visible, let's make the position widget take the full screen by setting its right and left properties to 0. Now, we can add the second container. Let's give it a color with an opacity of 0.85. Inside this container, we will add a column that will take a rich text and a text widget as children. Whenever you want to show a line or a paragraph that combines multiple styles, you should use a rich text, and then you will define a separate style for each text span. Let's give it a style. Let's use the padding property of the container to position the text inside of it. Since we don't want the text in the center, let's set the cross-axis alignment of the column to cross-axis alignment start. Let's add the second text span using the children property of this text span. We can copy and paste. Let's fix the letter spacing in the first text span. Now, let's create the second text widget and give it a style. We'll copy the style from above. Let's create some spaces between the text using the sized box with a height of 5. For this section, we will use another position widget. Remember, we are still inside the stack. Let's give the position widget a container as a child. We will set the height to 380. And for the width, we will use media query of context, size, width, -40. The -40 is because we are going to add a horizontal margin of 20. That means left and right margins. Let's use the decoration property of the container to style it. To give it a color, a border radius, and some shadows. Then, let's position that container at 200 from the top. Now, let's create the first row of the container. But before, let's add a column. Inside the row, we will again add a column for the text and the horizontal bar below the text. For the horizontal bar, we will use a container with a height of 2, a width of 55, and a color of orange. Let's duplicate this code to create the sign up option. The horizontal bar is too close to the text widget, so let's add some margin. Let's create some spacing using the main axis alignment property of the row, and also add some paddings to the main container. To highlight the selected text and make this horizontal bar that will move back and forth between the login and the signup, we will use one of our state variables, isSignUpScreen. For that to work, we will also need to add a gesture detector on the column. On tap, we will call setState and set the value of isSignUpScreen variable to false. That means the user has selected the login screen. We will do the same thing for the signup. Let's add the gesture detector, but this time, on tap, isSignUpScreen will receive true. Now we need to refactor the code to reflect the selection of the user. We will set the right color using the ternary operator. If it's signup screen, active color, else text color 1. For the horizontal bar, since we are inside a list, instead of using the ternary operator, we will use an inline if to show or not show the container. This feature was introduced since Dart 2.3. The link will be in the description. Let's implement the same changes for the login option. Let's organize the code to make it more readable. For the text fields, we had a container and inside of it, a column. I will explain later why I chose to add a container here. Let's add our first text field. One of the important properties of the text field is the decoration property that takes an input decoration. We'll use it to add the icon, borders, alt text, and more, to make our text field go from something like this to something like that. Let's start with the prefix icon, which takes an icon. We will use the Flutter icon package to get a material community icon. For the border, we'll use the enable border property, which takes an outline input border. We will use the border side to give it a color, and the border radius to make it rounded. As you can see, when the text field receives the focus, the borders disappear. To fix that, we need to also set the focused border, so we can just copy and paste. Let's add the head text. It takes a string. We'll style it using the endStyle argument. To make the text field a little smaller, we'll use the content padding property of the input decoration. Now, the text field is too close to the first row. Let's add some margins to the container. This is the first reason I added the container. There is another reason that we will see later. Now, we have our first text field. To create the orders, we can duplicate it by copying and pasting, but to better organize our code, let's extract the section of code in a method. We will call it build text field. The only thing that changes from one text field to another is the icon, the end text, and the type, if it is an email or password. Let's create those as arguments of the method. Now, we can refactor the code. To hide the password, we'll set the obscure text to is password, and for the email, we will use the keyboard type. If his email is true, text input type .email address, else text input type .text. Now, we can go back to the code where we were to create the other text fields by passing in the right argument. The text fields are too close to one another, so let's go to the method and add some paddings at the bottom. Now, let's create a row for those custom radios. Inside this row, we'll add another row which will have a container with a height of 30 and a width of 30. We'll use the decoration to give it a border all, a width of 1, a color of palette text color 1, and a border radius circular 15. Let's add an icon inside of the container. Then, a label for the radio using a text widget. The text is too close to the container. Let's give the container a margin right of 8. We could also use a sized box widget with a width of 8, but since we have the container, I prefer using the margin. So now, let's create a second row for the female radio button. Since it's almost the same code, we can copy and paste and just change male to female and add a background to the container. Let's add a size box with a width of 30 and some paddings at the top and the left. To make those radio work, we'll need to add some gesture detectors. For that, we will use our second state variable, isMail. We'll first add one on the first row. On tap, we will set state and set the value of the state variable isMail to true. Now, we need to refactor the code to apply the appropriate changes to the container and the icon based on the state of those custom radio buttons. Let's start with the background of the container. We'll use the ternary expression. That means, if it is male, we'll give it a color of gray, and if not, we'll give it a color of transparent. Same logic for the border. Let's implement the same changes for the female custom radio. To add this text, we will again use a rich text widget. The rich text takes too much space and is too close to the row. For that, we will wrap it in a container. We'll give it a width of 200 and a margin top of 20. If you want to make the text inside a rich text clickable, you have to use the gesture recognizer in the text pane. But we will not do that today. We have implemented a gesture recognizer in this video. Now, to create the submit button, we will have to use a trick. And this is where a position widget becomes handy. The trick will use the position widget to place a rounded container with a white background above the main container. Then, inside this container, we will add another container with a gradient background. And then, we will add the arrow icon. Let's do that right now. Inside the stack, we'll add the position widget. But first, let's organize the code and add some comments. we'll add the container as a child, then another second container. Let's give the position a top of 100 for now, and give the container a height and width of 90. Let's add a decoration to give the container a color of white and a border radius to make it circular. Now, we need to place it at the bottom center of this container. For that, let's set the right and left properties of the position widget to 0, and then change the top to 535. Let's wrap it in a center widget. This container will have a gradient background. For that, let's add a decoration box. Then, for the gradient, we'll use a linear gradient. It takes a list of colors. Let's add some paddings to the main container. Then, we will set the border radius to border radius circular 30. Let's fix the direction of the gradient. For that, we'll set the begin argument to alignment top left and the end argument to alignment bottom right. We need to add some shadows. Now comes the part that is challenging. We need to add a shadow behind this half circle. If you try to add the shadow to the right container, we can see the shadow above the container, and we don't want that. So the trick that I found to make this work is to have another white rounded container with the same size, at the same position, below this main container with a shadow, and the one above the container without the shadow. Instead of duplicating this section of code, let's extract this position widget in a method. Let's call it build bottom half container. Let's give it a parameter to know when to show the shadows. Now, to add the shadow under the container, we need to add the method before this position widget. The reason for that is since we are in a stack, the first widget in the stack will be under the other widgets. Now, let's refactor the code to remove the container with the gradient. We can uncomment this now. Let's create this bottom section before implementing the logging in the container where we will animate it. For the bottom section, we will again use the position widget. As child, we will add a column, then a text widget inside it. For now, let's set the top argument of the position widget to 600. As you can see, the text is not well positioned. To fix that, we will use the media query of context, size, height -100 to make sure we position the column at 100 pixels above the last visible pixel. We reset the right and left properties to 0 to make the position widget take the entire width of the screen. By default, a column will center its children. Now, let's continue with the buttons. As you can see in the design, the buttons don't have elevation. In the past, we would have used flat buttons, but in its latest versions, Flutter introduced the text button to replace the flat buttons. The flat buttons will be deprecated, so it's better to use text buttons from now on. Let's add the first text button. The child will be a row of an icon and a text widget. To style a text button, we will use the style property and give it a text button.styleFrom method. We'll start by adding a background color. We'll set the primary color to colors.white, then a shape. We'll give it a shape of a rounded rectangle border, and to make it rounded, we'll set the border radius to border radius circular 20. Then, add a border using the side argument. It takes a border side. The button is too small. Let's set the minimum size argument to size 145 for the width and 40 for the height. Since the buttons are almost the same, instead of rewriting all this code, let's extract it in a method and provide the icon, text, and background color as parameters. Let's quickly refactor the code to include those new parameters. Let's go back to the column and pass in the arguments, and also create the second button with the Google icon and the Google color. Now, the buttons are too close to one another. Let's fix that by setting the main axis alignment of the row. We'll choose Space Evenly. It's not quite exactly what is in the design. To fix that, let's create some margins by adding a container around the row. 20 to the left and right of the container to make it smaller, and 15 to the top to create some spacing between the text widget and the buttons. Now, let's create the login screen. As you can see, the design is almost the same, so no need to create new classes. Instead, if you remember earlier, we used the state variable isSignUpScreen, which is a boolean, to move between the signup and login. We will use the same approach to create the login screen. When the user taps on login, this will reorganize the screen for login. That means we will resize this container and recreate this section, and also change the welcome text at the header and this text at the bottom. So, let's do that right now. Let's start by refactoring the welcome text in the header of the page. We need to replace Resona by back and sign up by signing. As we did before, we will again use the ternary operator. If his sign up screen is true, Resona. Otherwise, we will show back. We'll do the same for the subtitle. If his sign up screen is true, sign up, else sign in. For this section, we need to change the text fields and add a checkbox inside the container. Before we do that, you remember when I created those text fields in a container? It was because I planned to extract it in a method to make the code easier to read and navigate. Let's extract the signup section inside the container in a method, and then we will create another method for the login section. This time, instead of the ternary operator, since we are inside a list, we will use an inline if to show the appropriate method. As I said earlier, this feature is available since Dart 2.3. If you want to read about it, the link will be in the description. Let's add a container, and inside this container, we will add a column. To create those text fields, we will use the build text field method that we created earlier and pass in the correct argument. The text fields are too close to the login signup row. Let's add a margin top to the container. Now, for this section, we will use a checkbox and a text button. Let's add a row, and inside this row, we'll add a checkbox. We will set the value to isRememberMe, which is one of the state variables. Then on change, we will set state and change isRememberMe to not isRememberMe. We will also set the appropriate color for the active state of the checkbox. Let's add the text widget and style it. Now, let's create this forgot password text. We'll use a text button for that, since it should be toppable. They are too close, so let's add some spaces between them using the main axis alignment for the main row. And now, we need to resize this main container. For that, let's go up and find this container. Using the ternary operator if it's sign up screen, the container will have the height of 380, else 250. As we can see, the main container for the login is a little lower than the container for the sign up. For that, let's change the top argument of the position widget. To better organize the code, let's extract the login text fields in a method. We need to change the position of the submit button also. Let's find the method that creates the submit button and change the top from 535 to 430 based on the value in our state variable. Let's make the same changes for this text at the bottom. Now, let's add some animation to the design. Fortunately, Flutter provides us with some implicit animated widgets. The first one we will use is the animated container. Let's go to the main container and replace it with an animated container. When you use the animated container, you must provide a duration argument, which is the duration of the animation. We will give it the duration of 700 milliseconds, and we will also change the animation curve to curves that bounce out. As you can see, we have many curves to choose from. We will do the same for the position widget. Since the position of the container will change from one point to another, this time we will use the animated position widget and give it a duration, then the same curve as the container. Let's test it. As you can see, we have a problem here. It is because of the way that Flutter renders the widgets. So when we click the animation, it takes 700 milliseconds to render the container. But in the meantime, all the widgets that are inside this container already rendered. That's why we have this problem. The trick to fix this issue is to put that column inside a single child score view. Et voila. Now we have another problem. When we navigate from the login to sign up screen, we can see that the submit button is a little ahead of the animation. To fix that, we will also animate this button. Let's replace this position by an animated position widget and give it a duration also of 700 milliseconds. And also the same curve as the other animated widgets bounce out. Now, it is very important that you try to create this design yourself. The best way to learn is by practicing. The link for the source code on GitHub is in the description below. But if you want to continue learning, watch this video or that video. Please consider subscribing and give us a thumbs up if you liked it.